Welcome to this webinar on Christianity and Asian American culture. We thought about this webinar in light of Lunar New Year and some other aspects of Christianity and Asian American culture. Thank you so much for taking your time out to join us today. We're here from Rooted. Rooted's mission is to equip and empower churches and parents to faithfully disciple students toward lifelong faith in Christ. And we have 5 pillars, and we're hoping that today's webinar will be beneficial to you. So if you're joining us live today, you can use the live chat feature to write your name and where you're from. And also, we're going to be taking questions throughout the webinar. So at the end, we can answer some of your questions that you might have, and we might be able to address them and share some answers. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our host, Clark Fobes. He's really good looking, but because he's half Korean, half non-Korean. But I just want to congratulate Clark. He just finished his Doctor of Missiology at Southern Seminary, and he's going to be our host and introduce some of our other panelists today. So, Clark, why don't you take it away?
Cool. Thanks, Danny. Good to be with you guys. Thanks for everyone joining on, if you're here live or those maybe who are watching after the fact. We are talking about this topic of Asian American culture and Christianity, and especially as it relates to young people. It's something that we've talked quite a bit at Rooted, especially if you've been in our Asian American pre-conference gatherings. But we wanted to do this webinar to really dissect the topic of how do we, whether you're a ministry leader or a person working with young people, learning how to translate anything from the basics of the gospel to themes of discipleship to your Asian students. Or if you're even thinking a little bit more specifically about what does it look like to create an Asian contextual theology. And so I'm joined by 3 panelists, Dorothy, Brian, and Kevin. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves a little bit about where you are and what you do? Let's go in that order. Start with Dorothy.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Dorothy Lau, and I'm the youth director at the Chinese Bible Church of Maryland in Rockville, Maryland. I've been serving here for just over 6 years and going on 7, and involved in various capacities as well, including worship, AV, and some building projects. But aside from that, excited to be here with you, as this is a topic that I have been delving into since I started in full-time ministry, and even before when I was in lay ministry in my early college years.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Rue. I'm also from Maryland. I actually saw Dorothy for lunch the other day, which was fun. I'm actually from Ellicott City, which is about 30 minutes west of Baltimore City. I serve at Bethel Korean Presbyterian Church as the youth pastor, and I've been here for about 4 years now.
Awesome. My name is Kevin Yee, and I am the former youth pastor at Church Every Day in Northridge, California, suburb just a bit north of Los Angeles. I'm currently working with college and young adults.
And I am Danny Kwan. I'm Rooted Senior Director of Youth Ministry Content and Cross-Cultural Initiatives. And before that, I was a youth pastor at my church for 29 years, and I almost died. But I am here today hosting, but Clark is our host. Yeah. Clark, can you say a little bit about yourself too?
Yeah, Danny almost died spiritually, but also literally. Yeah.
We'll get
so
into
I'm
that.
Clark. Yeah. My name's Clark. I'm an associate pastor at First Baptist Church in San Francisco. Was born and raised in the city. I've worked in predominantly Asian immigrant and Asian American churches up until about 3.5 years ago at my current multi-ethnic church in downtown San Francisco. So we're here to talk about this topic. And just as a brief primer, I think when we talk about any topic of faith and culture or faith and race, there's often this question of, how do we translate the gospel or theology into our culture? And I think it's important to just remember especially if you're a young person in ministry, that all theology is contextual. All theology is born out of the questions and the searching of scripture in a specific time and place and culture. And so what that means for us is we've by and large borrowed or adopted the white Western theology of the white evangelical church. And we have often had to translate that to our Asian youth students. But something that there's been more push for lately, and something we've talked about here at Rooted, is what does it actually mean and look like to develop Asian American theology for youth ministry? And so that's a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So if we could just kick it off, maybe just think more practically, what are some issues of faith and our Asian American culture that you guys have experienced or that you see as these major ones that we need to pinpoint or address in the Asian American church, and specifically for us working with youth?
I can start us off and say that a big one is the priority of academics, so much that academics and extracurriculars usually take priority over spiritual community. And in some way, students, because they choose that pathway, or maybe their parents strongly enforce that pathway, it can cause students and their families to feel estranged from the church. So I'm not saying it's like a particular cause and effect, but there are certain predictable outcomes that come from academics taking precedence over spiritual formation and community. And with that, it's farther down the line where we may see how when these students go into college or come back from post-grad years, they're not really following the Lord. And I think a lot of parents are concerned as to why that is. But again, the irony of when you choose one thing over another, that's how they get conditioned into just thinking that that's the only thing that matters and faith is always secondary.
Dorothy, just for future, there's some comments. If you could increase your mic volume, that'd be
Oh,
great.
yeah, sure.
Thanks for those comments. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to tackle that question?
This is related, I think, to the academics. But I do think that overall, one of the things that Asian culture really elevates is the idea that the teacher-student model, the expert teaching somebody. And I think the way that kind of permeates through the church oftentimes is this idea that ministry, discipleship is relegated to the professional. And so the idea is that the youth pastor is responsible for discipleship. That's why I send my kids to youth group. Parents often don't take the responsibility of discipleship on their own shoulders. And so that's a burden that we have to teach parents that that's actually biblical. That's the way it ought to be done. And actually, just because you say you're not doing it doesn't mean you're actually not doing it. You are doing it. You're just not doing it well is really what that means. So how do we as youth pastors kind of contextualize that, translate that into a form that's easier for parents to swallow and understand when so much of culture is you're the expert, you're the one that's supposed to teach my child how to do all of the Christian things and the church related things and the discipleship related things, and I'm just the parent. And those are different categories of how I'm going to raise my child up in the church. Yeah.
It's something I often tell the parents at my church. It's a multi-ethnic church, but a lot of our parents are Asian. And I always tell them every parent is discipling their children. Right. The question is, what or who are you discipling them into? Mm-hmm. And if it's unconscious, then subconsciously, we are discipling them into our cultural values, whether or not they are being filtered through the gospel.
Exactly.
If I can piggyback on what both Dorothy and Kevin said, I think the parents that I interface most with, just like what Dorothy said, I think they value very highly school achievement, academic achievement, achievement actually across the board. But somehow that sense of achievement doesn't translate super well in the context of church and what Kevin was saying in terms of discipleship formation, spiritual formation, just even brokenness in the home. And so when we talk with families and there's a certain sense of just brokenness or challenges that they face, students, teenagers face at home, maybe with regard to parents, and trying to navigate that from a point of view of achievement and success, and how, we do all things really well, and how you navigate that. I think that's been a challenge that I've been seeing more with our students in particular, especially around mental health and just the struggles, personal struggles that they're dealing with, and how do they broach that topic at home? How do they talk about it at church and so forth?
Would you guys mind speaking? Let's move from maybe the problem into how that actually looks like for you guys. So both the practical confrontation or conflict that has for discipling teens and ministry to families, but also what have you guys done to, at least with this specific instance of success, achievement, academia, maybe to confront some of those cultural idols and disciple and lead the families and youth in our church in a healthy but corrective way?
I would say that one of the ways that sort of has played out in our churches, I think there's an attitude among I think our community that because our kids have so much to do during the week at school with academics and sports and things, a church really needs to be a place where the kids can rest. And I think that's good. I actually think that's good. That makes a lot of sense, that the parents understand that this is a place where they should receive some sort of reprieve. But it also somewhat encourages this idea that, like, oh, if church isn't fun, then there's no value to that. And kids already feel that. Like, they don't want to be in a place that's not fun, right?
Yeah,
But I
just
think
have
parents
fun
can,
and entertain my kids.
right, exactly. And I think parents can often be too sympathetic to that idea because they want church to be a place where the kids can have fun.
Right.
And so I think that makes it extra challenging to try to do, serious theology, to try to do serious discipleship, to try to help the students understand sort of, for lack of a better term, the more academic side of the faith sometimes. And so I think that one of the challenges that we have is, how do you balance that? And I think working together with parents, I think like having really good communication about what you're doing and why you're doing is probably the best way to start to overcome that. Just making those expectations really clear. Like, our youth group is about this. Like, we are going to teach theology. It is going to be rough and it's going to feel dry sometimes. But in the end, after 4 years of high school or after 7 years or 8 years of youth ministry, the idea is we want your students to know deeply who God is. And while at the same time, we have all these events, and these events are going to help your kids connect with each other and have this fellowship and this community. The other thing about Asian American churches too is, more often than not, we are doing ministry in suburbs. I think a lot of us are, and we have people coming from all over the city, right? And so sometimes big events are the only things that students can prioritize and come out to. And so just making sure that those events really are fostering community and really helping kids do that side by side, get to know each other, a lot of ice breaking, that sort of thing. I think that's a good way to communicate with parents that you want to partner with them to get to know and to love their kids. But at the same time, I think always emphasizing that we have goals, we have spiritual goals, we have a vision for your students. Yeah.
I think what you said with anticipating the expectation with parents is a good thing. Something I've had to just lovingly correct our parents on is, what's the first question you ask your kids when you pick them up from school or youth group? Well, school, it's usually, what did you do? What did you learn today? Youth group is, did you have fun?
Right.
And if that's the first question we ask, we're communicating an expectation about youth group. And so even for myself, I've had to try to adjust that with my kids. The first question not being, did you have fun today? But actually, tell me a little bit about what you learned. So it's a subtle shift that I think we can foster.
And it starts in elementary. I mean, that's really where that starts, and it just keeps going. Yeah.
Right.
So now I ask, what attribute of God did you learn about?
It'd be like,
These
what's an
PKs.
attribute?
Yeah. What was the catechism question that? Oh, you did do catechism? Oh my goodness.
A cat?
Yeah. Tell me your memory verse now.
But I think, Kevin, you bring up a really good point in the working with parents, and that is one of the pillars with the Rooted Ministry is partnership with parents, in addition to theological depth, among other things, just because I can't remember them off the top of my head right now. But a big thing about partnership with parents, as I've come to appreciate, but also accept the reality that that assumes parents are mature spiritually and or have a desire and motivation to go into that direction.
Hmm.
Otherwise, I think something we may mostly agree on in our context is that in a very average Asian American church, there's so much people pleasing that happens because we don't
Mhm.
necessarily want to continue hearing the same type of feedback or criticisms of how come we don't
Mhm.
have this or that? Why can't the ministry be more of XYZ? And so
Mhm.
while I understand, the difficulties that parents face in their kids over programmatic and stimulated and scheduled lives, it is unfortunate that the reinforced values in the home are such that if anything is going to be given up, it would be church. And I think that's just a very average response. Not saying that it's the standard, but many families would say, oh, okay, well, if you want to do more, then something has to drop off and it'll be
Hmm.
youth group.
Mhm.
I will say that one thing that gives me hope is how I have seen some students, whether it be here in the DMV or maybe my previous context, they willingly gave up sports or other extracurriculars because they wanted to spend more time with the
Mhm.
youth group. I had a student here who he's a senior and in a well-achieving like a cappella group. And last week when we had our annual winter retreat, he decided to forego attending a competition so that he could participate in and help lead worship for our youth winter retreat. Um, and it was more fulfilling in this
Mhm.
case that he joined the retreat rather than going to the competition. Um, and so I think it's some of those deliberate decisions and how parents can reinforce or they can encourage their teens to continue choosing to grow spiritually or participating in opportunities that would further their growth. But it does take a certain level of, acknowledgement and maturity on the parental side of we can partner more effectively when our vision and our goals are aligned and we can support the parents, not
Mhm.
just come on as a supplement to their extracurriculars or that we're there to entertain the kids and they call it engagement.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I do think some of the decisions that ministries make do have to grow out of a certain conviction that might be antithetical to parents' decisions or parents' wishes.
Mhm.
A previous church that I served at, we had youth group night on Saturday night. And I was
Mhm.
used to like a Friday night youth
Hmm.
group, and I asked
Mhm.
why aren't we doing it Friday night? And they said that it was in the South, and so they said it's Friday
Mhm.
nights, it's football. We have football Friday
Mhm.
nights, and I was a
Right.
lot of our youth kids play football, and they said no, they're in marching band, and so they have to go to the games, and they participate on Fridays.
Or they're in yearbook
That's
and
Um,
got to
so
take pictures and stuff.
but it
I
come
love
it,
it.
you can't do youth group on Friday. And
Yeah.
in my current context, we actually do youth group on Wednesday nights, which is
Hmm.
school night,
What?
and that is partly we actually inherited that night somewhat out of not by choice because so many ministries meet on Fridays, and we could have done Friday youth group, but because we needed and wanted adult volunteers to be present, young adults,
Mm.
olders who if we had stuck with Friday, we would have lost that. And so we made a conscious decision to go Wednesdays. And I'm not saying that your ministry has to do that, but it was very intentional and deliberate and thoughtfully done. And you can see the fruit because a lot of our students enjoy that midweek break to be able to
Hmm.
get together with their church people and to be able to look at God's word together and to have fellowship and prayer. And
Mhm.
our small group leaders are committed and they come out every Wednesday to love on our students. And that is very countercultural to
Mhm.
the Asian American ethos and the mentality of like school first. And I think
Mhm.
it's somewhat we're trying to offer a reaction, or not a reaction, but an alternative view to
Hmm.
that.
That's great.
Speaking to your Wednesdays, I was actually the only time I was successful in doing that was actually with either a very small group of like high school leaders or actually with middle school as a whole when I was doing middle school ministry. And we were able to shift to Wednesdays because school doesn't matter as much. It's that idea that like colleges aren't looking at, sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. So, and then, sports and those kinds of things, like they're present in middle school and definitely now more than they were like 10 years ago. But it was a little bit easier with middle school to try to get to that place. And Brian, like what you said about that midweek break, getting together with your friends to pray with them and to have small group leaders, our Wednesday nights were amazing for that reason. So yeah, definitely something to consider if you're really struggling with numbers and with volunteers for middle school. Yeah. High school, I think that's a big cultural shift and you have to take a lot of time to prepare your church for that. So that's awesome, Brian.
Yeah.
Actually, on that note, I did have a number of middle schoolers this past year. I don't know if they were complaining, but they were expressing confusion as to why we were not meeting every single Friday. So context is that for the first time now in this school year or ministry cycle, we have mirrored the Awana program schedule where they gather for the first 3 Fridays of the month. And then we take a break or we say we're resting for the remainder of the weeks. And some middle schoolers who have younger siblings in Awana, they came up to me again with confusion. They're like, why aren't we meeting later in the month? I'm like, you're a little aggressive right now. But because in a sense, in the previous years, I actually told my youth volunteers, hey, if you can, and if you would like, just take a week off, one Friday off a month. We'll still be meeting, but just let us know in advance if you'll be there or not. And some of them did that. Some of them chose to instead be faithfully coming back every week to serve, and I honored that. But in a way, I think what can be countercultural is such that in Asian American culture, especially the immigrant church culture, if you're not getting ahead, you're falling behind. That's this false narrative mentality. And at the same time, it's like we feel guilty when we rest because we've been conditioned to think that we're not doing enough, whether to advance in our goals or even doing enough for the kingdom of God. And I had to talk about that with my team to say, we are not here to put productivity, even spiritual growth on a pedestal. And so since it seems that our own team has a difficult time to practice rest, we will just build it into our schedule. And that was something that kind of confuddled or confounded some of our parents at first, but then they said, we realize it's actually really important because these kids are busy. And instead of having them to choose one or the other, it's like, you know what? There's so many activities that can only happen in a weekend. There's only so much time that our students can have to actually practically and legitimately rest. And so why don't we as a ministry rest for just, a week out of the month? And that will serve also as you can have that time for yourselves if you want to organize fellowship, if you want to spend time with your non-Christian friends and be a light and witness to them in those days. I think that has definitely helped for our morale a bit more because we're seeing that, again, if we can't model rest ourselves, we can't expect our students to practice that either.
Right. Yeah, that's great. There's a really good follow-up question here on how do we discern between accommodating busyness versus turning away from busyness. And I think to your point of rest and practicing Sabbath is not something that I think Asian churches have historically done well. And if anything, I feel like COVID really taught us a lesson in Sabbath because we had to. I do think it brings up some questions too, though, and I've heard this of often it feels like we're competing between people doing activities in and of the world versus doing activities in and of the church. And we tend to pit the two against each other and think, well, formation and discipleship needs to happen in the church. Everything else outside the church is just competing. But I think when we model rest, we're actually showing that, rest is coming under the sovereign reign of God over all creation as he rested. Then all of our schedules, all of our lives are in a sense a form of walking in discipleship with Jesus. And so we don't necessarily need to always pit the two against each other. But asking the question, how do we lead our families to be practicing discipleship in the everyday, not just when the church gathers? I do think this also brings up another question, though, of how do we lovingly confront parents and families? Because we've talked about this has to do a lot with families. How do we lovingly confront and talk with and disciple parents and families towards this? Especially for, I'd imagine many of us either started or are still in places where we are younger than the parents we're talking to. And in Asian honor shame culture, you can't really tell someone older than you how to do something or what to do. And so, how do we approach that in a way that honors the elders or older generation in our church while also not succumbing to the pressures and cultural idols?
You can't, because you're gonna get fired. So we just don't. We just sit
Hopeless.
there and we stew in our corner. Yeah.
Grow bitter and die. Oh no. So hopeful.
No, but I think it's one of the reasons why like trying to stay at a church as long as you can is pretty critical. The youth pastors I know that have been in their churches for 4, 5, 6, 7 years plus. I mean, they just have more trust. It takes a long time to develop trust with parents. When you're trying to dismantle cultural idols, if you do not have trust, you are not going to get anywhere. You're just going to piss people off. I think it's super important that you build trust, and the best way to do that is have some strong convictions from the get-go in terms of vision and convictions for sure, but also grace and flexibility in relationships, right? Because that's the only way you gain trust. If you don't have those relationships, you're never going to get anywhere. And so I think it's really, really critical that youth workers, youth leaders have relationships with parents. Now, to your point about the whole age thing and the elder thing, when I when I was younger and I used to hear about youth pastors that are in their 20s having like, oh yeah, I had lunch with a parent who's in their 50s, I was like, that would never happen at our church. Like if I asked to have lunch with a parent, the parents would be like, wait, is my kid doing something horrible? Why do you want to meet with me? And then it's just like, so yeah, and it's just like super tense. And you're just like, oh, this is uncomfortable. And then you haven't gained any trust. You've just been like the weird guy that wanted to meet with a parent. So I think you do have to work through volunteers more often than not. If you're there's usually adult volunteers that are hanging around youth ministry. I think it's forming relationships with those that number one can speak English, right? I think that's language barrier is also a factor too. But utilizing volunteers to kind of help bridge the gap there, I think is super critical. So you have to spend time, if you can't spend time directly with parents, you have to spend time with parent adjacent people in the church who can help bridge those gaps and speak on your behalf, really. Just as much as might be nervous to have relationships with parents, I think parents are they're nervous about having those relationships too. Yeah. The other strategy is just stick around long enough to become older than the parents, and then you can tell them whatever you want to. Yeah. So Danny can attest to that. Yeah. You'll almost die, but you'll get some traction.
Oh man.
I will say that in my context, all the parents are older than me, and I am not the best at being able to have those conversations. So I openly admit that as much as I'm an Asian American second generation, part of me still adheres to the traditionalism of you cannot confront your elders. And perhaps they may feel inclined to confront me, or that they go straight to the supervising elder or deaconesses. And I'm very appreciative of that one, so that I don't have to personally field more of their emotional comments than rational ones. But respectfully, I also think that because they go to those designated individuals, and perhaps not me directly, they have been shielding me from criticisms that may otherwise probably easily discourage me, in all honesty. And I don't know if it's just for the sake that I'm a woman who is younger than them, or that they have more of a relationship with those other leaders. I think it is, Kevin, just to reinforce and to advocate, it is really important to talk with parents. At the same time, not every comment that parents may make are uh, well informed, meaning that it could be an emotional reaction to half information
Right.
versus actually participating in the ministry and having an
Mhm.
understanding of what is the vision, what are the goals, what are we trying to challenge students with, versus just seeing an issue that is not convenient for their family or conducive for a specific subset of family values that they may hold. Um, but something that I've
Mhm.
had to lovingly confront in a family or two is the issue of contingent values. And so what I mean by that is it's like asking a question about preference. In this situation, what would you do? And most times students may say, well, that depends. Like, what do you mean it depends? Like, when it's cold out and you want to eat noodles or you want to have hot pot, whatever. It's like, well, it depends. Sometimes I want ice cream. I'm like, um, so what I mean by contingent values, it's such that um, it doesn't matter what the situation really is. It's just how they feel in that moment. They could choose anything. And so there's, I think, this sense of inconsistency that occurs in what a family actually prioritizes. And so if one of the highest values is of convenience, then I think in some ways we may compromise our integrity or a sense um, of honesty just for the sake of, well, I don't know if this really works for me in this specific moment. And so uh, kind of to use Kevin's language of when you start to confront those cultural or functional idols, of course, people will become upset because you're taking away a sense of comfort that they may have had for X amount of time. And I don't know if I've always been the most gracious and flexible when it comes to making those adjustments. So I acknowledge, being in a position of being a youth director in a intricate church where there's three congregations because of languages. Sometimes I may, truthfully cop out to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, parent. Like, I can't speak Mandarin, so you're gonna have to talk to that person." Or, "Sorry, I can't really speak Cantonese, so can we speak English?" Or maybe you can talk to that parent, right? I'm not gonna always default to that strategy, but I think even in this case, it is convenient to say, "Sorry, I don't speak your heart language, so can you put it in an email?" Right?
Mhm.
So just there's always adjustments that need to be made, but at times I actually get scared of parents sometimes because when they talk it's much more emotional than it is rational, and I try to see the
Mhm.
facts, not just how they feel, but I do acknowledge how they feel. So yeah, just some things that kind of brought to mind when Kevin you were talking
Mhm.
on that point.
Mm.
Maybe if we could shift gears a little bit. We've been talking most of our time on how do we confront, but what we also want to do is celebrate and uplift our unique cultural heritage and what it adds to our faith in the gospel. Are there some things you guys, when you look at your Asian churches or ministry to Asian youth, that I guess are ways where we can celebrate our unique cultural heritage and our faith, but also uh, things that our culture brings to light on our faith in the gospel that maybe we can celebrate and not just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also adds to the broader Western American and even global church.
One of the things that I'm so grateful for, so I serve in a Korean church context, and one of the things I'm so grateful for is Korean church's commitment and devotion to prayer and
Mm,
revivalism.
hmm
Those are actually two things I really appreciate. Prayer is actually one of the sort of heart languages of our church, and I think many, many, many Korean churches. And so I think it's easy to ask parents to pray, and in the midst of asking parents for prayer, not that this is a manipulative thing, but you can be honest about the struggles of youth ministry. So when you're presenting, these are the things that, we're going to be doing this morning prayer campaign for, a month on family ministry. Like that's the theme for this month. And then you can submit prayer requests towards that. And you can talk about the things that are going on in youth ministry and bring those up as things that need to be prayed over. And the truth is we trust that parents pray at our church. It's one of the the most positive things I think about working in the Korean church context is that. And then secondly, when I talk about revivalism, I'm talking about this idea that retreats is where you meet Jesus, right? You don't have to go to church any other time, but as long as you're there at summer retreat and winter retreat, you are on fire for the Lord.
You're meeting God on the mountaintop.
Yeah, like it's so easy to get parents buy-in for retreats.
Yeah.
Like it just is, And so I think for us, like, and for I would say a lot of Asian American youth ministries, like retreats become these central pillars for how you can do sort of restarts, resets, revisions. There are places of like launching things, launching new initiatives. Parents are a little bit more paying attention. I think it's a double-edged sword because I also think that leads to some weird concepts of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus.
Right.
But I do want to advocate for, you know what, this is the way it is. And so how do we take advantage of the fact that these things are things that we don't have to ask people to buy in for? Like a sleepover camp where most of the leaders are under the age of 25. Okay, in no other context would parents be like, oh yeah, here, take my child. But it's a church retreat. Hey, no problem. This is just the way it's done, right? Yeah, it's a cultural thing. So things to like I've come to help try to get people to understand that, like, sometimes it's a really frustrating thing, and there's definitely a period of a couple of years where I so hated the idea that we lean so hard on that. But I've come around to the other side to see actually how beautiful it is that, if nothing else, this idea that you're going to the mountaintop to meet the Lord, it's still like a cultural remnant, and I think there's multiple ways to take advantage of that. So,
if anything, that brings us closer to Israel, that was instructed in Leviticus 23 to have the Feast of Tents annually, to live in tents again and remember the time in the wilderness and turn their face towards God.
I think it was you, Kevin, just in my time knowing you, I think you said that for one of your retreats, you ask parents to come pick up the students at the retreat. As part of the final days, like testimony time and things like that. And I've actually sat with that idea for some time. We've never been able to execute it, but for my ministry context, and most Asian American contexts where they value family, the overlap of family and church and worship is not particularly done well in my context, because we run a separate Sunday worship for youth.
Right.
The times, we when we do family worship, it's once or twice a year, Thanksgiving or like Christmas or Easter. And so the idea of having parents be an integral part of their Christian faith and upbringing, especially in terms of like what it looks like in church, is it's not very pronounced and very visible. And so we've been trying to work on that. Like Asians are very much about family. We're very much about church because we're the church. But how come we can't do that well?
Yeah.
And so we've tried to do things like Dads and Youth Day, which is coming up in March. And we've tried to just bring dads together to help plan an event where they just focus on our youth kids. And, the downside to something like that is that it becomes an event. We're really good at orchestrating events. But at the same time, there's moments where we have dads who don't have students in youth group who also participate. These are older elders and father figures of our church who are trying to catch a vision of what we're doing. And so anytime where we can create some areas of overlap between our parents and our students in the church context is something that we strive for, and we try to celebrate as a win. Sometimes it's hard and it's awkward because our teenagers are in that stage where they want to keep parents at arm's length, but we try to at least try to help facilitate the conversation and say, this is normal. This is actually good. This is something to be celebrated. And I think, little by little, we're seeing people celebrating it with a joyful heart. Whereas before, I think it was something very foreign and strange, even though it's so part and parcel of our Asian American identity.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's
Kevin,
really
can
good.
you speak more to that too? Because I think it was you, and I was talking with another friend about this. We're at their retreat. The last day was a time of honoring the parents and allowing the kids to honor their parents like verbally in ways that maybe they wouldn't on a normal basis. And I just felt like that really combined the sense of honor of our Asian culture, but also bringing the very Western piece of the verbal affirmation, which we do not tend to
Hmm.
have in Asian culture, and
Hmm.
just how I think it was you and this other friend I was talking to, just how transformative that was to the relationship, both just parent child, but also of faith in the family.
Yeah, that's why anytime anyone in a movie or TV show ever says like father to son says I'm proud of you, I just like break down, right? It's like I needed that, I need that so bad. Um, but yeah, so the retreat thing started because we realized that so we were trying to because we would go to camps that were like 3 hours away. You'd get a bus, you'd go to the camp,
Mhm.
you'd come back, and we were trying to do these sort of like post retreat recaps for parents so that they would
Mhm.
know what was going on at the retreat because parents would, pick up their kids and they'd ask their kids, like, so how was the retreat? How fun was it? But kids would be like, it was good. And then take a nap in the car, Excuse me. And I was like, that was it. Right. So it started with sort of, ooh, how can we help parents with that frustration of like, I just invested, like $250, $300 into this weekend for you to go to this retreat. And all I get back was, it was good. Like I ate a lot of ramen, like campfire was fun, things like that. And it's like, I know that more happened because I went on youth retreats, like, but my kids aren't opening up to me and telling me anything about what happened at the retreat. So I was like, okay, that's the felt need. And we can actually use that to kind of shift our culture a little bit. So what
Yeah.
we did was we started looking for retreat centers that were close enough that parents could drop off and pick up their kids. So I know this isn't possible for every city or whatever. I mean, we went to some janky places to make that happen, but we prioritized, genuinely places where it's like, is it safe to be here? But we
Is the water safe?
prioritized, yeah, we prioritized parents being able to drop off and pick up their kids. And basically the last day when parents come to pick up the kids, we would hold them hostage for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. And we've done all sorts of things during that period of time. But the main thing was getting parents and their children to actually talk to each other, for parents to hear directly from the kids what they should. So we'd set them up in small groups, and then we would give them like prompts, like at this time now you're going to discuss this question, you're going to discuss this question, you guys are going to pray about this together, and you're going to talk about this. So we really kind of programmed it out because I also know not a lot of kids have the ability to really share with their parents, especially in the 9th, 10th grade. That age is so awkward. But the idea was those prompts were really helpful because again, it's the group think, it's everybody doing it together. The other thing is we take away phones during the retreat, and we'd say like you can't get your phone until your parents come and pick you up. So that was also just a extra little practical incentive. But that was really, really successful for us in terms of helping parents understand what we're doing in youth ministry, and forming relationships. I know so many Asian American youth pastors that don't even know who the parents are of their kids, and that's normal. And I'm not shaming anyone for that, but it is normal. And so one of the ways we can flip that around is just trying to get as much FaceTime with parents as possible.
That's great. That's awesome. We're shifting in kind of our last 10, 15 minutes. So if anyone else has any more questions, we'd love for you to send those in. We'll start tackling some of the other ones that you guys sent in earlier. Some of these could be longer, but we can try to hit them a little bit quicker so we can touch on more of them. One question that came up, we sort of talked about this, but how can Asian American youth bring their own unique cultural heritage in a way that influences the majority culture? And that may be at a non-Asian church, or even just as our kids are, I guess maybe the way we can think about it is how can we encourage our kids to think about their unique Asian culture intermingled with their faith in a way that sees the good in it. So we started talking about that, but let's talk specifically with youth.
I think that the question prompts me to consider how, in my own teenage upbringing, this is kind of a lighthearted comment, but I wish that my cultural foods were popular when I was growing up. Whereas now, it's like, oh my gosh, I love fried rice. Oh, you have fried noodles or dim sum? That slaps. I'm like, great. Okay. But when I was, growing up in high school, bringing that, be like, oh, is that fish? Ugh. Is that sushi? Disgusting. I'm like, more for me. That's anyways. Um, but as I've kind of interacted more with students these days, it's really that like it's trendy to be Asian. And that
Yeah.
kind of gets me a little,
Mm-hmm.
bitter about my past. But it's so trendy to be Asian. And at the same time, I think for as long as students have been in this country, or, the more generations that are stretched in the States versus in their ethnic heritage. So like if you're third, fourth generation, like Chinese or Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, et cetera, American, I think that there is a greater distance from the original heritage culture. And so in some ways, while we want our students to appreciate and in many ways incorporate their culture in their spheres of influence, they're actually more westernized in greater regards than we may imagine. And so in a way, it's like, how can we help them to even recognize and to walk in their culture or their ethnic heritage, and to value it as well. I remember like just growing up in a predominantly white school and being a second generation Hong Kong Chinese American, I kind of shielded the fact that I was bilingual for a long time, because in middle school I was ridiculed for being Asian, and then high school all of a sudden it's cool to speak a second language. And for many of our students, they don't even speak their heritage language anymore. If anything, we have Chinese kids learning Korean and Korean kids learning Chinese. So I'm just kind of confused on this whole hierarchy. But needless to say, one piece of advice I do suggest in helping our students to appreciate and incorporate their culture is to actually learn about their culture. Because I think most of them just don't know. They only go off of whatever is in pop culture. And I think as they come to appreciate the stories of their parents or their grandparents or whoever were immigrants to this country, they can be more purposeful in having the sense of gratitude for what they do have, not because of what they lack. So I think for my own sake, when I started to ask my parents about their immigration stories and resettling in America, then I also went on this journey of taking a lot of Asian American studies classes in university and almost got a minor in it, but did not want to stay an extra semester. But it caused me then to be more thankful for the way that my parents paved the way. And I didn't want to just take that for granted, or for the stories of my friends and their parents. So really learning each other's stories, your family history and heritage, and giving thanks to God that while we didn't have to go through those same struggles, it causes us to be then more cognizant that what we have is because of their labor and their toil, and also God's grace, most important.
That's something that I feel like the secular world is doing better than the church world. I've been super grateful that there's been a lot of media, like shows and movies coming out highlighting those stories more. And I do think it's helped create a lot more conversations in the home and in the church. I think there's examples of how we need to do that more. One that I, want to recommend to all our listeners is the Jesus I Wish I Knew in High School Asian American edition that Kevin Yee actually edited. That's a collection of stories of us as adult people looking back at our teenage years, but sharing those stories of pain, immigration, and asking the question, how does Christ speak into those unique cultural moments? But also, I think another one is just learning the Christian history of our backgrounds. I know it's something that Kevin did, and I got to do it with him along with AACC, Asian American Christian Collaborative, in LA and San Francisco. And that kind of sent me down this long path of actually researching the history of Asian American Christianity, and just being kind of amazed at how long that history is, because we tend to just think it only goes back as far as our immigration history. And for many of us, it's only 2 or 3 generations. But in my city of San Francisco, it's probably the city where the first of almost every Asian church was started in mainland America, in the early 1900s, and even earlier than that for the Chinese in 1853. So the more we can attach ourselves to those stories and learn from our ancestral Christian histories, I think the more we can realize there is an integration of faith and culture, that we're building off of. It's not entirely brand new as much as it may have been baptized in a wider Western theology at the time.
Yeah, super important. I was actually super blessed to be able to worship with a 6th-generation Chinese church
Mm,
in Hawaii, Honolulu. So that was
awesome.
really, really awesome to see. Yeah.
Mm, that's awesome. There's another question here that maybe is close to my heart, but I think a lot of a lot of second and third gen Asian Americans are starting to intermarry across Pan Asian marriages or Asian and non Asian marriages. Um, how do we help those kids of mixed Asian descent or mixed heritage uh, understand the gospel for them when they are navigating multiple cultures or two different cultures? I'm not sure if you guys have that many mixed babies like myself in your churches.
I do have some biracial students in my ministry, and many friends who grew up in those liminalities as well, like this in-betweenness.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the sometimes confusion or the awkwardness that comes with being biracial is you don't necessarily fit neatly in one category.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's so much to be gleaned from that in how um, in the Bible we see so much of stories of identity, of immigration,
Mm-hmm.
of being a people resettling in another land, and
Mm-hmm.
the only thing that stays consistent is the fact that God is still sovereign, that God is still our creator. And I'm always a fan to try to create space to hear those stories and to acknowledge that there are, you know, a multiplicity of cultures or ethnicities that may exist in a given ministry context. Even just thinking about 2 or 3 students in my ministry who are like half Chinese, half white, or half Korean, half white,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them actually being half Jewish, descended from the tribe of Levi. And so um, being able to have conversations about that and asking students, you know, regardless of their age, about what is it like to grow up between these two cultures. I know that for a time there was some common and unfortunately naive or ignorant verbiage that said, oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. It doesn't matter to me. But on the other hand, I would say it is important to acknowledge color, or it is important to acknowledge differences because you can honor them.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense of how some campus ministries, if they're not ethnic specific or say Asian American and they're multi-ethnic, if we were to remove culture from that salad bowl or mixing pot, it's such that certain gifts are not emphasized or able to be fulfilled in those ministries. So kind of going back to your question, Clark, of like, how do we really incorporate and acknowledge those cultures coming from biracial backgrounds is, I think it just starts with asking questions and helping those students to feel cared for and seen and heard, and creating those spaces so that they may feel comfortable and confident to explore a part of their heritage in this space and maybe a part of their heritage in another, and that we can still welcome them with the love and community of grace that we want to put forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Wynn had a good comment. He has biracial kids, or he or she, sorry, Wynn, but as the fastest growing demographic in the country. And, you know, I'm always encouraged to see, thank you, Wynn. I'm encouraged to see how many more mixed race kids there are in my youth ministry than when I was growing up. I was the only one, or I had one or two other kids. And but I think the majority of our youth group are mixed Asian, at least, youth kids, like Chinese, Filipino, Korean Chinese, Indian and white, so on and so forth. And so with those kids, and really with their parents, I've really tried to encourage their parents to not be colorblind, like you said, Dorothy. So I think often those parents come from a standpoint of like, well, we don't see each other's culture or race to make our marriage work. But actually just acknowledging like, hey, your differences that may create conflicts, that's a unique and good thing. And you need to learn to work through that together so you can work through that with your kids. And so I think it starts with the parents again. How do the parents talk in informed ways about faith and culture together as a family so that they can lead their kids. And I think I wrote about this in the book, but I wish I had someone to help me walk through that when I was a young person, because I had no idea how to navigate my identity. And yeah, I think that's a huge growing demographic we need to learn to work with youth today.
Real quick, if I can just add, I actually think it's a huge. It's really good for us to consider the biracial experiences, mainly because I think when we're so monoethnic, sometimes we just assume the way we do things is the way we do things. We never explain ourselves. We never think deeply about, hey, how does this come across to somebody else? You know,
Yeah.
Like when I was growing up in youth group in my sort of Korean monoethnic church, like we play games where like we would punish each other afterwards, and they were severe. Like, yeah, like you would slap each other, and it was just like normal, you know. And then one time, you know, someone brings a friend who's not Korean, and it was like, wait, should we be doing these? Like, it looks like we're abusing each other. So it's like, and so you just don't know until you kind of put the lenses on of somebody else. So having an awareness of that, I think, is super, super important. And it also helps for us to evaluate that question of like, ooh, how much of this cultural stuff is actually we're just doing it because it's cultural versus is this actually okay, or is this actually good for us to be doing? Like, does this further gospel witness? And maybe those are some of the things that we need to start to de-emphasize and start to emphasize other things. So we can't do that evaluation unless we have that awareness. And I think,
that's good.
Biracial kids give us that opportunity for us to do that and to do it together with our youth leaders too, you know. I think that's super important.
Yeah, that's good. Or maybe acknowledging the good parts of what we're doing that are culturally inherent.
Sure.
That like, hey, we're not going to be ashamed of this. We're going to own it.
Right.
But we need to be aware to own it well. Yeah.
And to explain why.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Unless anyone has any final pressing questions, you can drop it in the chat. Danny, is there anything else you want to mention or to wrap up for us as we close out our time together?
I did want to invite you, Clark. You've been a great host, and thank you, panelists. But now, as a almost doctorate in missiology, in studying, missions and, just cross-cultural ministry, this idea of Asian American culture and Christianity, this is probably like a 1 hour answer. I'm asking you to summarize, but
in 30 seconds.
Because we've talked about church and ministry and the gospel, but how does the gospel fit into all this?
Yeah.
In 30 seconds or less.
30 seconds, yeah. I'll just share it from a brief thing that I was actually reflecting on this very morning. I'm here in Los Angeles for a leaders conference for AACC, and we went to a prayer meeting. And I was just kind of reflecting on, why does it sometimes feel like I am a spectator of other people's faith, sometimes even in my own church? I think less so now that I'm a multi-ethnic church, but in the past, I was just kind of reflecting, being back in a Korean church now. I think something I realized was if we never learn to talk about and celebrate and confront our own cultural uniqueness, idols, and areas we're made in God's image, then we will unknowingly adopt a gospel that feels foreign. And so therefore the church will feel foreign. And I think that's something that I didn't realize till I was in college. I had mainly heard a individualistic, white, guilt-innocence lens of the gospel. Jesus absolves my sins like a judge clearing my record. I had never been to a court. I was a bad kid, but not that bad. So what does that mean? But when I heard the gospel expressed in the communal relational terms of Jesus taking my shame, releasing me from the shame and hiddenness of darkness of sin, it opened me up to a new experience of the gospel. And so something I've just been reflecting on is how can I receive the gospel for myself or experience the gospel in a way that touches my heart's language, so to speak, not necessarily the heart, the foreign language, but the heart language in its emotive, thematic sense. And I think that's why it's so important to think through these things like we've been talking about, so that the more we can identify what those areas are, the more we can speak the life of the gospel, the freedom of the gospel into that. And yeah, my field of missiology, one of the reasons why that's so important is because it seems to be that the world is shifting away from a Western individualistic lens. As much as it's secularizing, there's something new being birthed out of it that's a coming together, honestly, of East and West.
Mm.
That famous quote, East is East, West is West, and never the twain shall meet. Well, actually, East is West and West is East, and the two are sitting in between. And so I think we have so much to bring to that as Asians, as Asian Americans, third culture kids, to lead the charge for the global church in a sense. I mean, I don't want to say the Asian American church is the new prophetic voice, but I do feel like there's a lot that we have to offer the world and the global church. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the gospel is powerful in that. And at Rooted, we're really initiating a lot of cross-cultural initiatives. Kevin's book he edited, Jesus I Wish I Knew for Asian Americans, is a great resource for Asian American teenagers. We have podcasts for Asian American youth workers. We have a new podcast debuting in March for Asian American parents. And we have one day Asian American youth worker training. We did one in Houston, doing one in LA in March, and other cities will be coming up. And so we are really trying to think about how the gospel speaks into our culture and Christianity. So we're excited that the gospel is something we can find hope and joy in, and we can believe that it's true, powerful, and informative and transformative.